And good morning. Welcome to Sal's class. I'm Dave.
Oh. Dave, we need you to unmute.
Dave, you muted yourself.
Dave, you need to unmute, hon.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to Sal's class. I'm Dave, along with Lauren and George, and we're hosting this class. Please use stop video to help with Zoom bandwidth and use speaker view. When we get to question and answer, please ask one brief question so everybody has a chance to talk, and please turn off your video. And without further ado, here's Sal.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Last week was, introduction to what I want to present through the series of classes about Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, and the wars. And I tie it back to 1979 because there are multiple events that are taking place there that link the three of them together. And you can think of it as building blocks, that each of the events becomes a building block that contributes to 9/11, contributes to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I want to go through what each piece of that puzzle is that provides the foundation for those wars. But I also want to give some broader context to what's going on here that may be the source of the friction. And so I want to begin with the scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa has gotten a lot of attention as historians have researched World Wars I and II in depth, and they've continued to go digging deeper to look at really where did those antagonisms begin. And so what eventually erupted in the world wars were frictions that were there when the Europeans decided to colonize the continent of Africa. It's important to understand that they had a model for colonization that was derived from the New World. That is the Columbus expedition to invade the Americas, followed by the British and the French and others. And so that model, what eventually happens is the Brits wind up muscling everybody else out of the way. And so when they get to Africa, they decide we're not going to have that happen again. So they start staking out their claims very aggressively around mid-century. And what's happened is the international slave trade had been outlawed by England, and England had the biggest navy. And so it really threw the slave trade into disarray. And many countries had investments in Africa for the slave trade, and they didn't want to lose those investments. So they looked at Africa to say, what else can we extrapolate out of here that will benefit us if we don't have the slave trade, even though an illegal slave trade continues long after that. But and so what they by the mid 19th century, the Europeans really didn't know that much about the continent. They had traded for goods. They had, certainly participated in the slave trade, but all of that was cordoned off along the coast, so that they never really got inside to be able to know what were the various resources that were there. And they begin with missionaries to go in with a private agenda for not just converting people to whatever religion they were going to convert them to, but to find out what exactly are the resources that are there. And obviously they come to find it is rich in resources. Mind you, simultaneously, in parallel, is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution means that you can make a fortune of money by mass producing goods and services using machinery. And that technology for the machinery can also now move those goods rapidly. And so, but what it needs, it has to have the natural resources to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And so Africa becomes really a focal point for the world powers. And as I mentioned from our earlier classes, and I've repeated it probably too many times, but keep in mind that the human experience changes with agriculture. Takes probably about 5,000 years for this new system to really get in place, but it is a mechanism for creating wealth, power, and greed. And so what the name of the game is, despite all the obfuscations, is find something that everyone needs, take control over it, and have a monopoly and be able to rake in as much money as you possibly can. We can disguise all of it based on religion, nationalism, fighting brutal dictators, all that stuff. But understand that is really a mask for how can I get a bigger bank account. And so the competition eventually erupts in warfare, World Wars I, World War II, and that disrupts everything. Mind you, the Ottoman Empire was in place and controlled a large land mass, but they were on the side of Germany. They lose. The Ottoman Empire dissipates. And at that same time, oil is being discovered, and it is now going to take on, because of the Industrial Revolution, an even greater role. First, we had steam power that will drive motors and engines for the rail services. Now we're going to open up a whole new avenue of energy, and coinciding with the combustion engine being developed, this is going to be a real moneymaker. So what do you want to do? You want to take control? You want to create a monopoly? Understand, John D. Rockefeller. How did John D. Rockefeller get rich and famous? Well, he had control over oil when it was just petroleum. Made money out of selling petroleum that could be used for candles and that sort of stuff. Then they discovered that they can refine it into oil for combustion engines. And he had built up the company to a point where, it was a big player. Then what he would do is negotiate deals with transportation services to say, here's the price that I'm going to negotiate with, that we're going to settle on for what you're going to charge me for your services. And as a part of our agreement, you are not allowed to sell your services to anyone else at this rate. You can only sell it for a higher rate. So his competitors were at a disadvantage. And then he would, you had predatory capitalism, and he would buy up all of the smaller companies until he had, ExxonMobil, right? So at this time, people have learned their lessons. They now know that they want to take control. They want to have monopolies. They want to sell commodities that people have to have, and they see a future opportunity with oil in the Middle East. And so British Petroleum, Shell, Exxon, Total, they go and they form the Turkish Petroleum Company and the Anglo-Persian Petroleum Company. Iran and Iraq think that they have extensive reserves of oil, but they don't really know how to explore for it. So they make deals with the big companies where they can come in, do the exploration, they can extract the oil and use it, and that these countries will take a percentage of the revenues. And so what eventually emerges is conflict between big oil, and big oil learns very quickly to corrupt the governments as best as they can, and then to be at war with what was a sovereign state. And so when we look at the roots of the antagonisms, why do they hate us? Why do they fly planes into our buildings? Why do they do all of it? Well, the roots of it go right into the turn of the century. And so in Iran, we have the Anglo-Persian Oil Company formed in 1909, later changes to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In 1951, after trying to renegotiate with the oil companies, Iran nationalizes their assets to throw the oil companies out, but the blowback to that results in it being privatized within 3 years. We then get the National Iranian Oil Company, which is controlled by British Petroleum. There's then a sentiment for independence from big oil, conflicts there between them, ultimately erupt in a revolution in 1978-79, and the Shah of Iran is kicked out, and leading to the current government that we have today. In Iraq, there's the Turkish Petroleum Company in 1912, followed by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. They merge, and it's later named the Iraq Petroleum Company, and then becomes named the Iraq National Oil Company. It is nationalized in 1972, and you'll never guess who was behind that: Saddam Hussein, which American intelligence helped come to power, and then when he nationalized the oil, he became our enemy. So, and today they have production sharing agreements, and you can dig into them deeper to see what that's all about. But and so at the end of the First World War, Britain wants to take over Iran as a protectorate. Yes.
I will.
Excuse me?
Oh.
Someone trying to get me? No? Okay. And so at the end of the First World War, Britain attempts to operate a protectorate of Iran after the Ottoman Empire has completely collapsed.
So I thought, but 11.
However, rebelled, and the Shah asserted power.
Now I can't find the message. Oh, wait a minute here. Wait a minute.
Okay, David.
All right, so we have somebody.
877.
Sal, I'm going to mute everybody.
Yeah,
got it?
And then why don't you and then unmute yourself. Sal, unmute yourself. Sal, unmute yourself.
I understand. Okay, we got it.
Okay.
Okay. Let's get this one up. Share that. Let's take a look at this.
Europe became mired in the horror of the trenches, and Russia plunged towards Bolshevism. Persia sank deeper into chaos.
Out of the chaos of the World War came a new leader, Reza Khan, colonel of an Iranian Cossack regiment. In 1921, Reza Khan with a handful of men marched into Tehran and assumed direction of affairs.
و زمانی که دولت قاجار 15 سال بعد از مشروطه از بین رفت و دولت جدیدی آمد، نیاز به یک ایدئولوژی سیاسی تازه داشت و نیاز به یک سری بنیادهای تاریخی، یک سری ارزش‌های تازه و یک سری افکار جدید. در واقع رضا شاه وارث این تغییر بود.
Like Ataturk in Turkey, Reza Shah was a westernizer. He too believed that the key to progress was national revolution, armed forces, industry, and secularism.
Il avait beaucoup d'admiration pour Atatürk. Quand Atatürk avait créé une république, il pensait qu'il pouvait être président de la République. Donc il a cherché à instaurer la République en Iran, mais le clergé chiite s'y opposait formellement.
تضادی بین رضا شاه و روحانیت به وجود آمد.
After 1,300 years, the women of Iran have been emancipated. They may go about unveiled, free to mix with other men and women and to take part in the life of their country.
در واقع یکی از حرکت‌هایی که پدر شاه کرده بود هم مسئله کشف حجاب بود که یک حرکتی بود که در واقع درش خواسته خودش رو تحمیل می‌کرد به زنان جامعه. همونطوری که امروز هم حجاب تحمیل میشه به زنان جامعه.
Reza Shah created educational system based on modern Western type like schools, universities and so forth. And this was something that the religious group in Iran did not appreciate.
یه سری نهادهای مدرن رو در ایران به وجود آورد.
He did it by force, but he brought the country together.
While forcing his country into the modern world, Reza Shah returned to its origins, bringing back Darius, Zoroaster, and Persepolis in order to oppose the Shiite clergy. Persia became Iran, the land of Aryans. Islam was to be but a memory.
به دلیل اینکه به قدرت رسیده بود، بر خودش فرض میدید که این ایدئولوژی رو تدوین بکنه.
در حقیقت رضا شاه الگویی رو که در ایران تلاش میکنه به اجرا در بیاره، همون مفهومی از
be acted out. Its players.
Okay, so the Shah comes to power, and he is. Mind you, what's happening is the British are attempting to take over. The Shah, the Iranians fight back, and then they bring to power the Shah. This is the father of the Shah that most of us know that was thrown out in 79. And so the Shah, though, is in conflict with the Iranian parliament and with the religious leaders. And he's a guy who kind of vacillates a lot. Yeah, but he is able to play different political interests against each other and keeps himself in power. And it's important to understand that he is, in conflict with the Western countries. This is post World War I. Before World War II, he cozies up to Hitler as a way to antagonize the West and to try to play them against each other, play the West against Germany so he can retain power. By the end of World War II, and by the way, what happens here is Iran, Iraq are attacked by both Germany and Russia, all of whom want control over that oil, because by the end of the war, oil was the predominant world commodity. We also get out of World War II a kind of a false lesson about Hitler taking over the world and appeasement at Munich in 1938. Why I say that is that the powers, Britain and France, didn't have a choice about what was going to happen at Munich. They had not been able to rebuild their military where they could entertain another World War I. So they were trying to fend it off and buy time as best as they could. But it informed decision-making, meaning that whenever you saw a threat, you were to act aggressively against the adversary, that you couldn't appease, you couldn't negotiate, because if you did, you would be appeasing just like at Munich, and then this adversary would spread like a disease and you would not be able to contain it. And that became really an underlying viewpoint during the Cold War. And what you would get is, because we had nuclear bombs now, they started fighting proxy wars. So you would have a friend of Russia going up against a friend of America, and they would be fighting proxy wars for them. This is important because eventually Iran becomes engaged in a war with Iraq in the 1980s, what becomes what many people would argue was a proxy war for Saddam Hussein to fight America's adversary, Iran, as a means for repairing the frayed relationships from when he nationalized the oil resources. So, but with this conflict going on between Reza Shah and the clerics and with the parliament, along comes another power, and that is Prime Minister Mossadegh, who's been an adversary of the Shah, and he rises in power in the parliament, and it sets the stage for him to then attempt to nationalize the oil assets.
Serving as winners and losers, a tragedy in which each believed they held the key. Mohammad Mossadegh, now back in power as prime minister. Ayatollah Kashani, leader of the religious party. Avril Harriman, President Truman's special envoy. The Shah of Iran, of course. Stalin waiting in the shadows. And oil, the key protagonist on which the plot unfurling from Tehran to the shores of the Persian Gulf hinged. In the spring of 1951, in a great surge of patriotic fervor, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry. Before Nasser or Nehru, Mossadegh embodied the rebellion of the so-called Third World in the face of colonialism. Once again, Iran acted as a laboratory.
He was a prominent politician, a person who had his education outside. He was a lawyer, had good education in law in Switzerland.
And he was a real nationalist. He hated the British influence in Iran. He came to the conclusion that the only way to terminate that influence was to nationalize the oil industry and get rid of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. That period coincided with the time when 8 major oil companies actually exercised complete dominance of the world oil industry. So they were in a very powerful position to be able to fight against Mossadegh's idea of nationalization.
The Persians think that by nationalizing oil, they are going to get rich. Unfortunately, the reverse will be the case.
The Iranians paid heavily for their restored pride. The British enforced a complete embargo intended to smother the nationalist movement. Iran's leader was physically weak, but his political will had not been quelled.
Iranian economy was under sanction, oil sanction, the first oil sanction that you can see. And this first oil sanction against Iran stopped Iran from receiving any income out of the export of the oil.
The embargo had the opposite effect, sparking a united front. Ayatollah Kashani, who had returned from exile a few years earlier, would build the bridge between the Nationalist Party and the Religious Party.
Everybody knows that his background was a pure good Iranian that was, for the sake of Iran, saying what he believed, and because he was a top-ranking clergyman, he knew that whatever he's saying should be based on his belief, and the belief of him was the belief of the common people.
البته توی قانونامه از پیشرفت اصلاحات خصوصا در 50 سال اخیر که انگلیس ها مسلط بر نفت بوده و مداخلات ناروایی در تمام شؤون سیاسی و اقتصادی و اجتماعی این کشور می‌کردند.
Les délégués du gouvernement pour la nationalisation ont pris l'avion pour rencontrer les envoyés britanniques. Comme viatique, ils emportent le Coran, la collade du Grand Mellah et un des drapeaux que brandissent leurs partisans et qui porte inscrit « Si Dieu est avec nous, quel obstacle pourra nous arrêter ?»
This had to be looked after carefully. Influence had to be retained, but at the same time, deny oil and influence over Iran to the Soviet Union. So it worked well on both accounts, both for oil and for the Cold War.
For another party, it too founded on the legacy of the revolutionary ideals of 1905, was at work. Operating from Moscow, the two-day Communist Party was stirring up the streets.
Demonstrations culminate in the tearing down of signs over company offices and the raising of the Iranian flag over the installations. Desperate mediation efforts are made as Britain appeals to the International Court in The Hague and receives a temporary injunction against the seizure.
The U.S. chose this moment to enter the fray once and for all. President Truman dispatched a special envoy to Iran, Averell Harriman, whose official mission was to act as a mediator between the Iranians and the British.
Mr. Harriman undertakes a series of conferences with Prime Minister Mossadegh. Out of these conferences, hope emerges that the crisis that threatens world peace may now be averted.
As it had done in Korea, and would soon do in Guatemala, Indonesia, and Vietnam, the U.S. chose to intervene in Iran. Its first aim was to contain the Soviet threat. But that day in Abadan, Averell Harriman was above all party to the compelling decline of the old European powers. Washington would fill the void left by London. In Iran, the global oil drama was being taken over by a new director. In the fall of 1951, Mossadegh gave the British staff 1 week to leave the site.
Evacuation of women and children by air is stepped up as tension rises. The last 300 British technicians are evacuated a day before the deadline set for their expulsion by the Iranian government. And with their departure, the whole free world faces two problems: that of a depleted oil supply and a possibility of a war-provoking incident in the Near East.
خدا نخواسته اگر جنگ سوم بروز کند تمام این تمدنات و ترقیات و تعالیات برای حفظ استعمار دول استعماری از بین خواهد.
Like Reza Shah before him, Mossadegh appealed to the international institutions and flew to the United Nations in New York.
After we've heard them, after we've heard the representative of the Iranian government speaking for his government, if his statement does not appeal to us, then we can postpone. But to postpone without giving them a chance to be heard would be in violation of the spirit of the Charter.
The Iranian oil crisis comes to America's shores as Premier Mohammad Mossadegh arrives in New York to plead his nation's case before the United Nations.
Le Conseil de sécurité n'est nullement compétent pour examiner cette plainte.
The United Nations and the Hague Court ruled that they were not competent to judge. The old warhorse won a dual victory. But Washington feared the Iranian example would spread. Embroiled in anti-communist McCarthyism, America was torn between international law and controlling the oil.
Americans were lying, even when they were lying to Mr. Mossadegh when they received him in Washington. They were lying when they were trying to be nice to him. They were lying when they were saying that we are going to just do some sort of politics in order to solve this problem. They wanted to solve the problem for their own sake, and they wanted just to have their foot in the same footprints that the British had for a long time in Iran.
Mossadegh wanted a democratic Iran. He held the communists at bay and distanced himself from Kashani, president of the parliament. In the U.S., the newly elected President Eisenhower was keen to settle the Mossadegh question.
He forgetting that if he could not have the support of the religious leaders and having the masses with him, very soon those who are sneaking like CIA, intelligence service, and USSR.
I think what Mossadegh was, he was using the communists, the Tudeh party, against others so that he was balancing between them, playing one off against the other. But I don't think that he was very pro.
Mossadegh was a problem for the U.S. and for the British.
And happened the part of the history which is the saddest part of us for the contemporary history of Iran, which was the coup d'etat.
The coup was organized by the British and the Americans. I think the Americans had the lead role at the end.
And what was the plan? Just toppling a nationalistic government. Good or bad, having friction with the religious leaders or not.
It was part of the mystique of the agency at that time. It seemed that this was sort of a magic weapon, covert action run by the CIA.
The same scenario would...
Sal, you're muted.
Okay, so what we have is Mossadegh is overthrown in a coup d'etat that was led by American and British intelligence. Think about it. I mean, it's important, you know, we have, well, the communists, we got to fight these guys. It is for oil. It is because this commodity will make people filthy rich. We are going to overthrow the sovereign government, and it's up to us to do. It's wherever it is, we'll find some excuse to have a fight because we're going to get the oil. And it's important to see this pattern, because when we get to what becomes future conflicts, what are they about? You know, well, no, it's not about oil. It's about removing a brutal dictator. Think about that. It's just, there are all these obfuscations, all these, you know, they contrived reasons really obfuscate the fact that what you're doing is you're simply using raw brutality to get your way. And so what we get is the Shah comes back to power, and it's called something of a soft dictatorship. He creates the Savak, which is the Iranian CIA, to crush any opposition. But he also, again, he angers the West. How does he anger the West? He joins OPEC and the oil embargo of '73. And he also starts to initiate development of nuclear power, which America doesn't like. He continues to repress people in Iran, Iranians, but then there becomes critics, first with intellectuals, then with religious leaders and students, and they start demonstrating in protest. Khomeini, who was a religious leader, remember there was conflict with the religious leaders. Khomeini had been exiled. Where did he go? He went to Iraq. You know, Iran is a Shia nation, Shia Islam. In Iraq, it is run by Sunni Islam. That's the people who hold power, but they are minority. The majority is Shia. So, he gets exiled there, but now as these protests are gathering steam, it causes concern on the part of the Sunni leadership in Iraq, because they don't want this revolution spreading into their country as well. So let's see what happens here.
During his 14 years in exile, Imam Khomeini had ample time to meditate on Iran's destiny over the past 100 years. After being forced to watch from the sidelines, he would finally become a player again. It was not as an opponent that he would return to Iran, but as a revolutionary. Soon he would represent Islamism to the world.
قبل از اینکه ایشون از فرانسه برگردن به ایران، این ارتباط در بین نیروهای مذهبی و غیر مذهبی که هر دوشون هم مترقی بودن، چون تو یک مسیر حرکت میکردن، وجود آمده بود. در زندانها که ما هم بودیم همه نوع افکار بود.
The first revolution was led by students and the like. It was not a revolution led by the mullahs. They took it over.
اون زمان ما خیلی از مبارزان ضد رژیم شاه رو در موردشون میشنیدیم که اینها رو دستگیر میکنن، شکنجه میدن.
Are you satisfied with the methods which SAVAK uses to get confessions and to get convictions? Because they're also very much criticised.
They are improving more and more every day. You have been accused of torturing people too in the UK.
We're not proud of it.
Well,
به نظر نمی اومد که حکومت شاه حکومتی باشه که بشه باهاش مذاکره کرد و در واقع از طریق اصلاحات مردم خواسته هاش رو پیش ببرن.
Mais vous considérez systématiquement toute opposition à votre personne, à votre régime?
Pas du tout, je parle simplement du marxisme, soi-disant marxisme.
Parce qu'il existe à notre connaissance en tout cas une opposition religieuse assez forte aussi.
Non, ça c'est pas sérieux.
Blinded by the power play between Washington and Moscow, the Shah did not see that the world had changed. In Iran and the Middle East as a whole, revolution was now religious.
هم انقلابی بود هم اسلامی. یعنی ماها که مذهبی های پیرو امام بودیم، خب هم انقلاب کرده بودیم علیه استبداد و استکبار و در چارچوب اسلام هم بود.
Ce sont des gens qui voudraient voir les choses se passer comme dans le Moyen Âge.
جمعی هم بودن که خیلی به اسلام توجه نداشتن، فقط انقلاب رو، حالا یا ملیگرایی داشتن یا سوسیالیستی بود.
Imam Khomeini, contrary to all these kinds of methods of movement, he believed in a fundamental and radical movement as Islamic movement.
Religious people, they fought violent, as you know, against the students.
Other groups had no choice other than joining the movement.
خود ما قبل از اینکه ایشون بیان شورای انقلابی غیر رسمی تأسیس کرده بودیم.
September 7th, 1978. For the first time, demonstrators demanded the Shah's departure and the return of Imam Khomeini. That evening, martial law was declared. The next day, Friday, September 8th, the army opened fire on the crowd gathered in Saleh Square. It was a bloodbath. Hundreds died. The blood of the people became the blood of the martyr. Ritual Shiite signs mixed seamlessly with revolutionary symbols. For the Shah, it was already too late.
The contemporary issues that we have.
And so the Shah is run off. We have the killings in Zala Square, which simply pours fuel on the fire. Khomeini returns to Iran. The Shah flees. Students then demand that the Shah, what happens is the Shah flees and he comes to America. Jimmy Carter allows him to come here because the Shah has heart problems, and Jimmy wants to, get him medical care here in America. And the Iranians, however, and he's also at the same time making arrangements with Egypt, who has agreed to allow him to be exiled there. But first, he comes to America, and Carter wants to get him his health taken care of. The students, though, demand that he be sent back to Iran to stand trial for the killings in Zala Square and other charges against him. Carter refuses to do that, and it becomes the spark that ignites the students to seize the U.S. Embassy and hold people hostage.
In today's world are overshadowed by the events of the Islamic Revolution, and particularly by the takeover of the American Embassy.
The hostage crisis began on November 4th, 1979.
The students decided to take action on their own as a revolutionary movement, as a student movement, and to take an action which would prevent any sort of plot against the Islamic Republic, and that would keep and ensure the integrity of the revolution.
I got a call about 6 o'clock in the morning from my regional deputy. I was chief of Near East South Asia Division in the Operations Directorate. And his words were, "They're coming over the wall." These activists were coming into the embassy.
One of the voices that rings most clearly in my mind was her saying, at a certain point, they've broken through the door, we're going down now. And then the phone was open for a while, and you could hear some noise in the background, and then it went dead.
در مورد اینکه ما آگاهی داشتیم به خاک کشور خارجی میریم، خب بله این آگاهی وجود داشته.
We have to go back to the context in which the students took that decision. Those were the early months after the Islamic Revolution. The country was practically in shambles.
یادآوری خاطره کودتای 28 مرداد که منشأ این روابط بعد بین مردم ایران و آمریکا بود، اون خاطره در واقع زنده شد.
The coup d'etat of 1953 against Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh was a very, very dark moment of our history. It had taken the country into years of foreign domination, colonialism, and dictatorship.
We were deeply conscious of the fact right from the start that the resentment of the 1953 coup and the American role in that was deeply seared on the souls of the Iranians.
The students felt that once again the revolution is under constant threats, foreign threats, and that there might be a repetition of history.
ولی اینکه این جریان آیا به یک در واقع آثار خیلی زیادی منجر میشد، نه، این فکر رو نمی‌کردیم. فکر می‌کردیم یه چند روز قضیه حل میشه و تموم میشه میره. سابقه ای هم در دنیا از این جریان به این شکل وجود نداشت. اما به دلیل پیچیدگی هایی که تو قضیه رخ داد، ناخواسته این قضیه طولانی شد بدون اینکه کسی بتونه اونو در کوتاه مدت حلش کنه.
So finally, after months of this, an operation was conceived that would be short of all-out war, and yet would get the hostages out.
The so-called rescue mission did turn out to be a disaster for the administration.
The whole episode was very humiliating to the U.S.
The American commandos were wiped out in a sandstorm. As the ultimate humiliation, Khomeini's move to finally free the hostages favored Ronald Reagan's election to the White House. But these burned-out helicopter wrecks portended other wars on the horizon.
از اتفاقی که در سفارت امریکا افتاد، چه کسانی بهره بردن، چه کسانی ضرر کردن. آیا این واقعه تونست بهانه‌ای بشه برای کنترل و درجا زدن اون روحیه انقلابی ایرانی ها و اون فرصتی که انقلاب ایران داشت تو منطقه ایجاد میکرد؟
These events ultimately raise concerns in Iraq, who fears that this Shia uprising may spread into Iraq, and the Sunni power, which is the minority in Iraq, is very much concerned about it. We will examine the Iraq-Iran war, which commences in 1980, and we'll look at that next week. Okay, now we can open for discussion.
Please use the raise your hand functions and switch to gallery view. And please ask one brief question so everybody has a chance to ask questions to Sal. Is anybody have a question? So Sal, was Truman in over his head?
Truman? You mean Harry?
Yeah.
I don't know that I would say that. I think in some ways you may think that, but I really think that when we come to the end of World War II, the world remains in disarray. We are suffering a worldwide post-traumatic stress disorder, and we really don't know what are we supposed to do? Where do we go from here? What's the lesson to be learned here? There's not a time of reflection of people to really come to terms with, look where we've come. We're now using nuclear bombs to kill each other. Is this the way we should go forward? Yes, we've gotten the United Nations, and it's kind of a movement in that direction, but the world really seems to be without a moral compass that is very clear and gonna lead it in a new direction. So I think Harry is really reacting to the moment, and certainly there are forces that are going to be very powerful in screaming about communism and socialism. Mind you, today, the labels of socialist remain a potent political force. So I don't know if I can blame Harry too much. I think it's much bigger than that.
Norm?
Yeah, I noticed that the Shah of Iran is the only one who spoke French.
That he's the only
one who spoke French. He did not speak Persian. And it's interesting in the interviews. So I found that fascinating.
I think he does speak English. It depends on
not English, but why wasn't he speaking Persian?
Pardon?
Why was he not speaking Persian?
Again, the audience. He's not speaking to them. He's talking to, a foreign audience. Yeah.
And the Ayatollah Khomeini spent most of the time he was outside of Iran in Paris. And I remember seeing an interview when I was in law school. I think this would have been on early in the morning, where Mike Wallace interviewed Khomeini just before he returned to Iran. It was a fascinating interview.
Yeah, what happens is the Iraqis who had taken him in as exile, when all of this starts up, they shift him to Paris, again, because of their fear of the revolution spreading onto their land.
Howard?
Yeah, at first I thought that Carter made a mistake by keeping the embassy open there. There wasn't apparently a great deal of time between when the Shah left and when the students took over the embassy. But I would have thought that somebody in our foreign service would have said, get the hell out, now is the time, because of the memory of our overthrowing their democratically elected government. So was everybody in the foreign service an idiot and oblivious to history and thought that we would leave, the American embassy there as sitting ducks for this? I mean, who is ultimately responsible for what happened? Not the Iranians. The Americans were there to be taken.
Well, a couple of things. One is that within an embassy, based on international agreements, we depend on the country where we have an embassy to protect us.
Yeah, and but all bets are off with the Shah.
It is based on, we want to be able to be here so we can talk to you. We're just one building over here so that we can have diplomatic relations, even if we have the worst conflicts, so that we have an avenue for dialogue. And the embassy depends upon that government honoring that agreement and protecting the embassy. Mind you, it wasn't the Iranian government that attacked the embassy, it was the students.
But the government allowed it to happen.
And they allowed it to happen. But
okay, so they were complicit.
They were pretty much caught off guard. They weren't prepared for what was, it's like anything with warfare. You can plan everything out, but chaos is gonna be at the center of whatever takes place. Now, so that's one aspect of it, and it's up to the ambassador to decide to close down the embassy. It's same thing. That's what happened with Benghazi. It was in the hands of the consulate to decide, and he wanted to hang in there longer. So again, it's a difficult call, and they have contingency plans for what would happen if the ambassador decides to ring that bell, what happens? There's a whole procedure that people go through. And all of it is not that we're going to fight them off. It is because we can't. All of the embassies and consulates are protected by units of the Marine Corps, but they can hold off an attack for a period of time. But if they're under attack, they're not going to be able to withstand it. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is that when we've seen a lot of this with Cassidy Hutchinson, as she's been on her book tour, talking about going in and telling people stuff they don't want to hear, that contradicts what they already have, and they're big, powerful people. Mind you, this goes on all the time, where, don't offend the boss. The boss doesn't want to hear that. And so what you wind up doing is a lot of the intelligence people know what's coming. They can predict it. It's like a no-brainer, but you get where people are reticent in bringing that forth to people of power who don't want to hear that. It's like, look, if we let the oil companies keep beating up on the
my lecture is still in progress. It's going to be a few more
they're going
minutes.
to explode and they're going to attack us. Well, oil industry, we don't want to hear that. Don't write that up in a report. If they rise up, we'll find some communist, socialist, madman, dictator. Something will be the reason why we have to do this. We're not going to take ownership of our own complicity in what's happening. But the complicity is there. It's almost impossible to ignore. We're implicated in our own victimhood because we'll present that as our victim. Look what they did to us. Each night on the news, we had day 135 of the Iranian hostage crisis. Not what, something that's going to give people the impression that, wait a minute, we're getting blowback for the stuff that we did to them. Most Americans know nothing about it.
Cynthia?
Yeah, what did these students think was going to happen when they did? What was their goal? I kind of wasn't sure why they were there, climbing over the wall.
They were angry. Mind you, they've been involved in these protests now for a couple of weeks. They've had the killings at Zella Square. They're emotional. They're charged up. It's a force unto itself. They want the Shah to be extradited back to Iran to be held accountable, and America is saying no. And so they decide to play hardball too. You're not going to follow the law? Well, then we're going to seize your embassy. It becomes that tit for tat that is, endemic to any kind of, conflict like that.
Did they think that
they were in the tit for tat phase of the war? Right?
Did they think that we were going to trade the Shah for our people? Is that?
No, they wanted to put him on trial.
I know. Well, yeah, but I mean, did they think that we would give them the Shah if they gave us our people? I guess.
Yeah, it's important not to when these things happen, it's not a logical frontal lobe process kind of, plan. It is reactionary. And that's why people always say, when you're getting into the run-up for war, be very careful. Because once you start that, it has a force onto itself, and you're not going to get clear-headed thinking.
Thank you.
Gail, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to make a quick note to Norm's point about the French language. Ahmed Shah Massoud in Afghanistan spoke French, not English, and Farsi, of course, but he conducted his diplomatic interactions in French, which I always took to mean an intentional non-alignment with the U.S., but there was a serious French presence.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions? If not, I'd like ask everybody to unmute themselves and please, oops, I'm going to try to get everybody to unmute themselves. Yep, and please give Sal a warm applause for telling us what's wrong with the world.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sal.
Thanks, Sal.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Very good. Very informative.
Another great presentation.
Oh, wait a second. Lauren's got a question.
Well, not a question, but Sal, can you give us a preview of next week?
Well, I did already.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, our memories are not good.
You're not paying
So
attention.
much. No, you give us so much information. It's hard to keep it all.
See me after class.
I will.
Oh, here we are, Sal. It's after class.
I want to be sent to the principal's office.
Yeah. Well, now it's after class for the other people who snooze. What's going on next week?
Iran-Iraq war.
Or do you have to wait to next exciting adventure?
No,
I'm
I
sorry,
think what
what's
you have
that?
to do is wait till I post this up on YouTube and watch it again.
Ah,
And that's what I'll have to do. Okay. Well, everyone,
I
thank
hope
guess
this is making sense to everyone. I hope you can start to see the pieces falling
you
together.
expect this to make sense to us?
And,
Come on.
Why would Iraq want to go to war with Iran when things are going pretty good for Iraq? It was really a pretty bad decision on the part of Iraq, which we'll talk about next week. But
yeah, everybody should be able to start video if you'd want to, by just hitting the start video button.
Well, but okay. So I think we've finished here, and we'll see you guys all next week.
okay, thanks everybody.
That's good.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.